Thanks for sticking around. We're competing with the party, so thanks for staying with us. Next up is my friend Michael Andrews. He's going to talk about the relationship between headless content and knowledge graphs, sort of the parallels and divergences between those. So I'm really excited to hear this. Welcome, Michael.
All right, thank you. And my thanks to you as well for sticking through with the last session here. So headless content and knowledge graphs, how are they similar and different from one another? And I'm going to be suggesting that they have some similarities, but ultimately they're there for different goals. And part of this stems from that content has different qualities than data does. It's more variable than data, and how we associate content together is going to be looser than how we link data together. Headless content management, if you're not familiar with it, is an approach that's gotten very popular over the past few years as a way to publish content. And it structures that content, but it doesn't use a graph. We can use headless content management to publish any kind of content. So unlike traditional web publishing where we're thinking about web pages, with headless we can publish factual content, but also narratives. Games are very popular. Lots of different formats. We're not restricted just to text, but we can use video, audio, 3D models, and we can deliver it to really any channel online. So not just to websites, but to mixed reality or Internet of Things. Really no restrictions at all on how we produce and deliver this content. What makes it very different from traditional web publishing is that we're making this content query ready. And this, I think, is a very strong similarity with knowledge graphs. So we think about knowledge graphs, we want to query these knowledge graphs, get very specific information out of that knowledge graph. And headless content works in somewhat the same way. We structure the content, and we do that by creating what's called a content model. And this model represents different types of content that are broken down into fields, and we can relate these different kinds of content together. But importantly, the content model, the schema there is defined by the publishing organization. So it's not based on a standard that a committee has agreed to. Every publisher defines its own model. And we then also take this content and we separate it from how it's being presented. So it's not like a model that's a template for how the content's going to look when it's published. And this removes it not just from the presentation, but we've decoupled the content from the logic that's used to assemble the content. So in principle, we can create any kind of query and merge together any kind of content values we want, depending upon the situation that we want to support. Now, if we aren't using a graph for structuring this content, how might we use a graph with a headless CMS? And I want to tell you what I think a content graph is about. I don't think this has really been articulated in presentations I've been listening to. It is not a graph of data, because in my mind, the data is about regularized values. You know, we can say something's an entity. We can say something is a very predictable value there. In the case of content, we have irregular values. We can still structure them, but we don't always have know what those values are going to be. But we could, in theory, use an ontology to structure the content that we're going to publish. So we could use the ontology to organize this content, and we could use the ontology to orchestrate the content, meaning we're deciding which values we want to present at a given point in time using the ontology. Now, headless content management is being used by all kinds of organizations. You might work in a global candy manufacturer, on a marketing team using a headless CMS. You probably aren't in that role familiar with ontology. So we do need to think about who in all these different enterprises out there would be managing the ontology piece of this if that's how we're going to be managing the content we intend to publish. What are the differences between how Headless organizes content compared to an ontology? And it really gets down to the details that they're looking at. In a Headless CMS, you have content types. In an ontology, you have entities. And they're kind of looking at different things. Really, the big difference is that in a Headless CMS, you have lots of structure that is guiding the development of this content. And this is really an important point because we've been hearing about graphs for content like media where you've already created this content and now you're just trying to index it and slice it up. In the Headless CMS, you're actually using your model to guide what content to create. So it's a different thing than a lot of linked data where we're just trying to capture data that's already out there. We need to develop this content. So these fields guide what content's being produced. And this is audience, it's author-facing metadata, essentially. These are the fields we need to create values for. Then you publish the values. Obviously, the audience will see those values. And as part of the publication process, you may be also delivering some structured data. And that is there for machines. It's there after publication. So the difference of the metadata you need prior to publication compared to the metadata you need after publication. Now, there's obvious overlaps here. There are things that you need to create and then things that are going to be valuable after you publish them. And schema.org is the obvious case where you have this overlap. So can you use a vocabulary like schema.org as the basis of your content model in a Headless CMS? And the answer is absolutely, you can do that. And it can be valuable to do that. It's going to define a lot of fields that you know you're going to need content for. But one thing I need to make clear to you is that that's not going to be sufficient to guide all the content you're likely to produce. This is a great solution if you have some very straightforward factual information, not a lot of imaginations necessary. But if you're writing about the nutritional value of different kinds of puppy formula, something like schema.org is not really going to help you guide what kind of content you need to create. And we can see this difference in something like images. So if you're an author or an editor and you're trying to decide what image to include, there are all kinds of parameters you need to consider. The image format, how wide and tall is it going to be? Is this something we have to localize? There are all kinds of parameters involved there. And these parameters would be reflected in a content model that authors would be seeing. When you get to the image once it's been published, it's a much smaller set of structured data that different machines like Google would care about. So we have a difference in what kind of domains that content models would get involved with, and also the granularity that they get involved with. And often these are just go much deeper than ontologies go into. I see organizations structuring all kinds of content now. And they're doing it for lots of different reasons. They can be doing it to get a lot more granular control over things that they're publishing. It may be that they're customizing emails. They may be customizing tasks, getting more personalized feedback. When you structure all this content, you get a lot more control. You can personalize things. You can optimize your wording. It makes it easier to localize. Lots of good reasons to do this. But these are all very specific to each publisher, what they are trying to achieve with this. And ontologies being much more of a standards-based activity where you're trying to get everyone to kind of agree what everyone needs to exchange data around, don't get into this level of detail often. And I also see examples where even when we have ontologies, they're not sufficient to help us guide the content we need to develop relating to that ontology. And so we have great ontologies around things like drug trials. And if you're an expert, you can use those ontologies to extract important information. But if you're a patient and you need to understand how a drug undergoing a trial relates to your condition, you need a lot of context in the content to make it understandable to you. You want to have that information presented in a certain format. You know, I need bullets here. I want to see a graphic here. I need to know how to pronounce this drug. Maybe an audio recording would be helpful. So in a headless CMS content model, all these parameters can be defined very explicitly to guide the development of that content. Whereas in an ontology, we just don't get into that level of detail because it's a different use case. I see examples where when people do rely on data models to develop content, they find the data models just aren't giving them enough support. So this is an example from Microsoft where they had a data model for some learning content, and the authors creating the learning content found this model too abstract. It just didn't really give them a concrete sense of what the content was they needed to develop. So they went back and thought what they wanted to communicate, how they wanted to present this to learners, and then develop the data model from that. So it's important that the data model adapt to user needs rather than expecting people to adapt to the data model. Relationships. We can relate content together in a headless CMS content model, but it's a bit different than how linked data works. Linked data, you know, knowledge graphs, we have these predefined relationships that are pretty fixed. They're the logical relationships between entities. In the case of a content model, we can relate all kinds of content, but it's done on a much more ad hoc basis. So this is a screen showing how we can relate content in the case of like an event with an address. And we can see there's no coding involved here. People can make a lot of decisions around what kind of relationship they want with that address, you know, what they want to call the address, if they want to have multiple addresses or not, is it mandatory, is there a default address? All these things are options the author can choose. And they can make a completely different set of choices if they want to associate that address with something else, like a store. And this gives them a lot of flexibility, but it makes a less predictable set of relationships than you would typically have in a knowledge graph. So the relationships are looser in a content model. You have predictability as far as what fields are going to be associated with the content type, but when you're looking at how content types are associated, that is going to be much more variable. So just to summarize, the limitations I see around ontologies is that they aren't very strong in helping develop content because of their coverage in terms of the topics they cover, the details they cover, and the level of abstraction that they work at. But if we had an ontology, and could we use that as the basis for deciding what content to publish? So we're not trying to retrieve just one value here. We're trying to retrieve an array of values that are going to produce a meaningful experience for the reader. And this gets into what we in publishing talk about as orchestration, which is probably a little different than other uses of orchestration I'm hearing in the context of knowledge graphs. But it gets into things like real-time specific delivery of content values to people. And a lot of like personalization, genuine personalization is about orchestration. So it's about getting the right content to the right person at the right time. It is, about being very, very unique to the context of a person. So unlike something like if you see a knowledge panel and a Google search, that's kind of a canned set of values there. This is much more dynamic, and it's frankly more difficult to do. Now, knowledge graphs are very wonderful when we're talking about stable, predefined relationships. I mean, we all really enjoy seeing the the connections between things, being able to understand their relationships. We can kind of predict that there'll be, an understandable value as a consequence of that relationship. But in the case of a lot of content, we find that these relationships are much more conditional. They're much more contingent. They sort of change much more. And just as an illustration, think about the relationship between a product and an offer. I may be interested in getting a new iPhone. Now, I would love to be able to do a Sparkle query and get a definitive answer to who's going to give me the best deal on an iPhone. But as a practical matter, I'm not going to find a definitive answer to that question from a Sparkle query because there are so many contingencies there. Am I trading in a phone? Is that, what model of phone am I trading in? What conditions of phone in? What model iPhone do I want? And what stage in that product life cycle is that model I want? And all kinds of things come up here. And when we think about having our content as entities that have fixed relations between them, we have to start thinking about lots of variables that are not going to be exposed to the content viewer. So, a lot of these variables I'm talking about, I would never see in an online experience of looking at iPhone offers because they're hidden variables very often. And this really becomes obvious when we think about customers and their relationships to offers. So in principle, every customer could have a different offer. You can customize offers for customers. And you can build this into a graph. This is not a technical problem. You can take a lot of customer data that's in a customer data platform and load it into a graph database and then relate it to offers and relate it to products. And there are organizations that are doing this. But so much of these things that you're loading in here now are not content. They're not there to be viewed by people. They're not there to be published. They're there to manage the orchestration, which is, to me, is a different thing than talking about what a content graph is. So I feel that this is using a content graph as the basis of your orchestration is probably not the way to go in most cases. And the reason is that a lot of the relationships are going to be kind of brittle if you try to formalize them and put a lot of data, hidden data variables into your model. It really adds a lot of complexity. So if I go back to your everyday content publishers out there, of which there are hundreds of thousands of them across the globe, they really can't deal with thinking about all these hidden variables and things like that. They want to just be able to make a decision of, how do we want to connect this and that? And they do a lot of this on the fly as sort of ad hoc associations. We'll associate this offer with this product. We'll give them a free tote bag this week. That's what we're going to do. Next week, we're going to do something else. And this is really the way people like in marketing operate quite often, is that they're making these decisions, experimenting and trying to optimize things, aware that market conditions will change, their minds are going to change, and they want to have this kind of flexibility. So trying to formalize these relationships too much is going to take away control from the human side of how you're going to put these things together. So I'm kind of cautious on content graphs as the basis for orchestrating our content. I do feel in certain niches this can work, and we have heard some examples today about people using, say, product content graphs where there are some fairly stable relationships between a product and an accessory, and you can make recommendations around that. That's something that definitely has its role. But if we're talking about scaling this across the whole organization, where all your content would be managed by a content graph, I think that's not going to scale nearly as easily. I do, though, want to end on a note of saying I do think content graphs have an important role to play, and that involves tagging. So part of what headless CMSs do is structure content in granular detail. And we need to tag this to really understand what all these pieces are about. This is going to help everyone to be able to find the right pieces to deliver, whether they're an author and need to search through this, or they're a web developer needing to create a REST API query. So I hope that's something that we can all work on together, and I'll be happy to take any questions people have.
Thanks, man. Yeah, any questions from the audience? Yeah. Oh.
Hey, Michael, you had mentioned tagging at the end, and I feel like there can be a strong connection between the knowledge graph and how you implement like a tagging system. Could you talk a little bit what's a good strategy of connecting those systems together? Where's the entry point between that? Maybe it's not tagging, but
well, I think there's a real good opportunity to do that. I mean, I think so. We have different kinds of tagging we can do. We have certain amounts of tagging that we can do in an automated way, with named entity recognition and things like that. And you can sort of say, all right, this slice of content is talking about these things, and we can start tagging things that way. Some of the tagging will have to be a bit more manual, but at least if we, if you're saying what audience is this for, probably a human would be in a better position to tag that than a machine would be. But if we have at least an agreed, set of values that we're tagging against, and we have a knowledge graph that's being used not just for this CMS, but for other systems out there, be a digital asset management system, or a product information management system, or all kinds of ERP systems that could be sharing that same tagging values and ways of describing things. We then can help associate these other kinds of assets and data with the content itself. I think if you're looking at a more enterprise-wide approach to, having a knowledge graph to describe all your digital assets and properties, then you probably want to have a separate tool that's connecting with the CMS.
We have a question from Aaron Bradley coming in online.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I'll read it and just let you. So, well, first of all, he said his second question was about tagging, which you already got to. So nice mind reading there. But I'll just read the question. So rather than just structuring and orchestrating content, couldn't extending a graph structure to headless also introduce a useful inheritance structure? In current headless CMS practice, relationships, that is references, are arbitrary, and expected types need to be configured for each relation. There's no sense in which you can have a range apply to a type and all of its subtypes with similar problems for validation. You said that for content models, this is more ad hoc. And to me, to Aaron, this looser relationship is a deficit of content. He sees it as a deficit of content models, not a benefit.
Right. No, I can totally understand that. If you really come from a semantic web perspective, you want to have a predictable, logical relationship between everything, and that allows you to basically turn a lot more over to automation and being able to make predictable decisions around these predictable relationships. But I'm just saying from my experience working many years with publishing across all kinds of different content genres and content types and different organizations and just about any industry you can think of, that it's very hard to formalize everything. I mean, the content is such an open world set of things that you're talking about, and so much of knowledge graphs is really about drawing a boundary and saying, all right, we're only going to be talking about this area here, and we're going to agree that, you know, in the media world or something like that, you know, these are going to be the relationships, and this is what we're deciding to discuss. So, yeah, I appreciate that it does have its downsides to it, but from my perspective, just getting the structure in place where you're not having big web pages, but breaking it down and describing what each part is meant to do is going to enable us to do a lot more, whatever area of AI we're interested in. And so we have to bring adoption just to this before we can worry about formalizing everything across the board, I feel.
Any other questions? I wanted, Aaron had one other question. He kind of followed up on the tags. He said, and I'll just read it from here. You put tags in the content category, but taxonomies are awful to work with in contemporary headless CMSs. Obviously, has an opinion about that. Wouldn't a graph structure applied to structured content allow content creators and engineers to avail themselves of the many advantages of a SCOS taxonomy, which he calls among the most rock solid and straightforward of semantic standards?
I don't see any conflict between SCOS and you know, and taxonomy. It's just it's a, you know, a better way to implement a taxonomy. And you know, I think what a graph allows you to do is start thinking about you know, more dimensions to your taxonomy rather than just you know, hierarchies of nesting and stuff. You can think about the, you know, vertical connections and things where, you know, there are you know, near associations and things like that. So
yeah, and yeah. I think the more generic point there might just be that like decoupledness of like the separation of concerns of having the taxonomy and ontology and all that stuff happen over here and the headless content management there. Is that
well, okay. So I mean, I think so I don't really care where the taxonomy itself is stored, but I think it's important to tag the content with the content, just because the people who are writing the API queries around the content, they're going to be looking for that, you know, tag and basically, you know, say, you know, I'm looking for, you know, give me author fields with, you know, with the tagged in geography of Germany or something like that, and you know, you get your list of authors and you know, with a location and tag to Germany. If that information is starting to be stored somewhere else, then I think you're just introducing complexity to your everyday web developers who, again, you know, I think the RTL story was indicating, you know, that, you know, web developers are used to REST APIs, and you know, they are kind of expecting that, and that's who we have to work with. You know, we're kind of a small community here, and you know, I'm just trying to bring people along how I can, and you know, introduce a little bit more sophistication, but without sort of alienating them with what they're comfortable with.
Right. Yeah, and then that's maybe your presentation actually can be about authoring experiences in headless CMSs and how to manage things. Anyhow, I'm dreaming you. Well, thanks so much, Michael. And there's free beer up on the rooftop party. So and thanks for sticking around, everyone. Appreciate it. That's great, Mike. Appreciate it. Thank you. Like that whole bit of like the